Let me start with what I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you the agency. I cannot tell you the countries, and there were 9 of them. I cannot tell you the name of the program, because the program's name is still the property of a government, and the man at the center of this story spent 27 years being extremely good at not saying it. Here is what I can tell you. He was not a shooter. That is the part everybody gets wrong about men like him. His specialty, for 27 years, was putting ears inside rooms that belonged to other people. He was a technician. He wore a work shirt with somebody else's name stitched on it. He carried a clipboard and a spool of low-voltage cable and a small orange level, and in 3 decades, not one person in any of those 9 countries ever remembered his face, because remembering his face was the only thing he could actually fail at. I am Nathan, and I want you to hold that one detail while we go, because it is the whole story. Everybody in this story assumed that a dangerous man is a man who can hurt you. Miles Braddock was dangerous because he could listen to you. The other thing I can tell you is that on the 22nd of April, a 38-year-old man put Miles Braddock's 16-year-old daughter into a medically induced coma over what was on her phone screen, and that when a United States senator called Miles 4 days later to explain what was going to happen next, Miles said nothing at all. Not one word. He let the man talk for 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and then he hung up. I have thought about that silence a lot, because that silence was not a man being intimidated. That silence was a man measuring a room. Miles Braddock was 52 years old and had the least interesting resume in the state of Maryland. If you ran his name, you got a low-voltage contractor's license, a passable credit score, a 2009 pickup, and 18 years of tax returns from a company called Braddock Systems Integration, which installed door access controls, security cameras, and structured cabling for medical offices and small commercial buildings on the Eastern Shore. The Better Business Bureau had him at an A-. There was one complaint, from 2016, about a scheduling delay. All of it was true. None of it was the biography. The biography was that between the ages of 23 and 50, Miles Braddock had been what the people who write the paperwork call a technical operations officer, under non-official cover. In plain English, his job was to get inside a structure that somebody else owned, install something that recorded, and leave so cleanly that the building did not know it had been changed. He was, in the words of a man who supervised him for 9 years, the most boring genius the program ever had. He did not pick locks in the movie sense. He arrived with a work order. He learned the name of the property manager's dog. He fixed things that were actually broken, because a man who actually fixes the elevator is a man nobody follows to the electrical room. He memorized cable runs the way other people memorize faces. He could tell you, walking into a room, where the acoustically dead corner was and which wall a conversation traveled through. 27 years of that. 9 countries. 4 rooms that changed policy. 1 that did not, and cost 3 people their lives, and which he never talked about, not once, not to anybody, including his wife, especially his wife. Which brings us to the marriage. Lorna Braddock married Miles when she was 24, and he was 31, and she married a man who fixed alarm systems and traveled a lot for work. She was not stupid. Within 4 years, she understood that some of the traveling was not alarm systems. Within 8 years, she had stopped asking, and the not asking became the shape of the whole thing, the way a river becomes the shape of the rock it cannot move. Their daughter Sylvie was born in a hospital he reached 19 hours after the delivery. He was not a bad father. That matters, because it would be easier if he were. He was a very present father when he was present, and utterly, absolutely unreachable when he was not. And there is no version of that arrangement that a person can build a life on. Lorna filed in the spring. Sylvie turned 9. Miles did not contest anything. He signed the papers on the hood of his truck in the parking lot of a Royal Farms and drove to Dover and sat in a motel room for 2 days. What he did after that is the interesting part, and it is the thing that makes this whole story possible. He quit. At 49 years old, 11 months short of a milestone that would have meant a considerably better pension, Miles Braddock resigned, moved into a rented duplex 14 minutes from his ex-wife's house in Cadmus Point, Maryland, and started pulling cable for dentists. He did it for one reason: every other weekend, and Wednesday nights, and half the summer. That was the reason. That was all of it. And so from age 9 to age 16, Sylvie Braddock had a father who showed up at 6:15 on Wednesdays with a paper bag of something greasy, who could fix literally anything with a screwdriver, and who was so relentlessly, boringly ordinary that her friends thought he drove a plumbing van. There is a photograph from her 11th birthday of the two of them on the floor of his duplex with a tape recorder taken apart between them, 40 small pieces laid out on a bath towel in the order they came off. She is holding a screwdriver in her fist like a dagger. He is pointing at a capacitor. That photograph got entered into evidence in a federal courtroom in Baltimore. I will come back to it. Sylvie inherited exactly one thing from her father, and neither of them ever named it out loud, and it is the reason 9 people are in prison. She recorded things. Not video. Sound. She had gotten into it at 13, through a YouTube rabbit hole about field recording, and by 16, she had a scratched-up Zoom recorder, a wind muff she made out of a sock, a hydrophone she and her father built one January for $41, and 1,100 audio files on a laptop, organized by date and location, because she was her father's kid, whether anybody said so or not. Rain on 4 different roofs. The Cadmus Point drawbridge. Snow geese in November on the Wexford Flats. A washing machine she thought sounded like a heartbeat. The inside of a hollow steel piling at low tide, which is a sound I cannot describe to you but which she called the loneliest thing she had ever heard. She wanted to do sound design for movies. She had a spreadsheet of 11 schools. Now, Lorna remarried when Sylvie was 14. Brooks Kinsolving was 36 then, and he was, on paper, the best thing that had happened to that family. He was warm in the specific way that wealthy people are trained to be warm. He was good at remembering that Sylvie liked a certain kind of Japanese pencil and having a box of them show up. He paid off Lorna's car. He was funny about his own money, which is the most effective way to be rich. His father was Prentice Kinsolving, who had represented the state of Maryland in the United States Senate for 19 years, sat on 2 committees you have heard of, and had a boat named after his late wife. Brooks was the second son and the one the family did not talk about at the fundraisers, and Brooks knew it. And Brooks had spent his 30s building something that would make him unignorable. What he built was called Cardinal Path Recovery. On the website, Cardinal Path was a network of 11 sober living residences and 2 outpatient treatment centers across Maryland and Delaware. Clean photography. A lot of words like continuum and dignity. A stock photo of a woman looking at a lake. What Cardinal Path actually was is a business model, and it is not a rare one. And I need you to understand it, because it is the engine underneath everything that happened to a 16-year-old girl. Here is how it worked. A young person with an opioid problem and a parent's insurance policy is, to a certain kind of operator, worth between $30,000 and $90,000. Not as a patient, as a billing event. You recruit them, which in the trade is called body brokering, and you do it with cash, or a plane ticket, or a warm bed, or sometimes with drugs. You get them onto a policy, you put them in a house, and then you bill. You bill for urine. That is the real center of it, and it sounds absurd until you see the numbers. A comprehensive urinalysis panel, billed out of network, can run $4,000 to $6,000. Do it 3 times a week. Do it to 11 houses. Do it to a 19-year-old whose mother's employer has a good plan, and keep doing it as long as that policy has room on it. And the moment the policy is exhausted, that young person becomes worthless and gets put out on a curb in a town they have never been to before with a garbage bag. Cardinal Path Recovery build. Across 4 years, $141 million. Brooks Kinsolving's compound at Fair Harrow, on the water at Cadmus Point, was assessed at $6 million and had a boathouse with a heated floor. And here is the part that made it a crime instead of just an obscenity. To keep the beds full, Cardinal Path needed a supply of relapses. A person in recovery who stays in recovery stops generating urine samples. So at 3 of the 11 houses, and this came out of the mouths of 4 employees under oath, staff were bringing product in, deliberately, on a schedule. And the residents who overdosed were, when it was manageable, driven somewhere else before anyone called for an ambulance, because an overdose at the address is a state inspection, and an overdose in a parking lot 4 miles away is a statistic. Danny Pruitt was 19. He was from Hagerstown. He had wanted to be a diesel mechanic and he had been clean for 7 weeks in June. He died on the 9th of April, in the back of a white transit van, in the parking lot of a shuttered ice rink on Threadneedle Road in Cadmus Point, 4.5 miles from the Cardinal Path house he actually lived in, of a fentanyl overdose that took him somewhere between 11 and 40 minutes depending on which expert you believe. 2 men carried him out of that van and left him on the asphalt by the loading door and drove away, and one of them said, on the way back to the van, a sentence 11 words long. Sylvie Braddock was 140 feet away, in the dark, kneeling next to a storm drain, recording the sound of water under a parking lot. She had gone there on a Tuesday night in April because the ice rink lot had the best storm drain in 3 towns. That is a real sentence a 16-year-old said to a federal prosecutor, and the jury laughed, and she did not understand why. The lot drained into a culvert that ran under Threadneedle Road and out to a tidal creek, and at half tide, water moving through that culvert made a low cord that she had been trying to get clean for 2 months. Her mother thought she was at a friend's. She had told her father the truth, because she always told her father the truth, and he had said what he always said, which was, "Text me when you're rolling." She had the recorder on a small tripod at the drain grate with the wind muff on it, and she was sitting 11 feet away on the curb with her hood up, not moving, because you do not move when you are recording. She heard the van before she saw it. She did not stop the recording, because stopping the recording is how amateurs work. The file is 41 seconds long. It is Government Exhibit 3. You hear the culvert. You hear a vehicle door, sliding, the specific rattle of a transit. You hear 2 men's shoes on wet asphalt, and something heavy, and one of them breathing hard. You hear a sound that the medical examiner testified was consistent with a body being set down rather than dropped. You hear one man say, "Hey, hey, come on," in a tone that is not concern, it is annoyance. And then, 29 seconds in, you hear the other man say this. "He's a Marley House one, not ours. Say nothing." 11 words. Then doors. Then the van. Then the culvert again, alone. For 6 more seconds, until the file ends, because she stopped it with her thumb. She did not know what she had. She thought she had recorded 2 men dumping a drunk person, which she reported to nobody, because she was 16 and did not want to explain to her mother why she was in a parking lot at 10:40 at night. She did what she always did. She dragged the file into her folder. She named it what she named everything. 0409, Icerink Drain Halftide.wave. She did notice one thing, and she noticed it because she was her father's daughter. In the last visible frame of a photograph she took of her tripod setup, time-stamped 9 minutes before the van, there is a white transit already parked at the far end of the lot with its rear plate visible under a sodium light. She noticed it because the plate had a dealer frame around it, and the dealer was one her stepfather had joked about at dinner. She did not do anything with that either. She was 16. She had a chemistry test. Danny Pruitt's mother is named Charlene, and Charlene Pruitt is the second most important person in this story, and she never met anybody else in it until August. Charlene got the call on the 10th of April. She drove 4 hours. She was told her son had died of an overdose in a parking lot and that he had left his sober home 2 days earlier against advice, which was a lie, and she believed it for 11 days, because grieving people believe the paperwork. On the 21st, she got a phone call from a woman who would not give her name and who said, "Your son did not walk anywhere," and hung up. Charlene Pruitt started calling. She called Cardinal Path Recovery 47 times over the next 4 months. She called the state licensing board 9 times. She called the county sheriff's office. She called the insurance company, which was, and I want to be precise here, the single most useful thing she did, and she did it by accident, because what she asked the insurance company was not a question about a crime. She asked why her policy had been billed $11,400 on the 11th of April, 2 days after her son was dead. Hold on to Charlene. She matters at the end. Now the 22nd of April, which is the night this becomes a different kind of story. Here is the situation as it existed at 7:40 that evening, and none of the people in the house understood all of it. Sylvie had a 41-second audio file she considered a failed recording. Brooks Kinsolving knew a 19-year-old had died in a lot on Threadneedle Road because his operations director had told him, and he had spent 13 days believing that nobody had seen it. Lorna Kinsolving knew nothing at all. What happened is small and stupid, which is how these things always are. Sylvie was at the kitchen island editing audio on her laptop with the file open and her headphones half off. Brooks came in from the boathouse. She was excited, in the way a 16-year-old is excited about her own competence, and she said, "Listen to this. This is under the ice rink lot," and she pulled the headphone jack so it came out of the laptop speakers. He heard 41 seconds of a culvert, and then he heard 11 words in a voice he knew, because the man who says them is named Rusk and had worked for Brooks Kinsolving for 3 years. She has described the next 4 seconds twice, once to a detective and once to a jury, and both times she used the same phrase. She said, his face went administrative. He asked her, very calmly, where the file came from. She told him. He asked whether she had sent it to anybody. She said no. Why? He asked for the laptop, and she said no. That is the whole crime. That is all it took. A 16-year-old said no to a man who had never in his life been told no by anybody who was not richer than him, in a kitchen, over a laptop, with her mother in the shower upstairs. He took her by the upper arms and she twisted, and the laptop went off the island, and he shoved her, and Sylvie Braddock went backward into the corner of a granite countertop and then down 4 steps into the sunken living room of a $6 million house. She landed on the back of her head on Brazilian cherry over a concrete slab. The 911 call was placed at 8:04 p.m. by Brooks Kinsolving, and it lasted 2 minutes and 10 seconds, and in it, he says the following sentence twice. She fell down the stairs. Lorna came down while he was on the phone with a towel in her hair. The laptop was in the boathouse by the time the ambulance arrived. It was in the Chesapeake by Thursday. Sylvie arrived at Chesapeake Children's in Baltimore at 9:31 p.m. by helicopter with a Glasgow Coma scale of 7. She had a right-side subdural hematoma with a 5 mm midline shift, a linear occipital fracture, and a second bruise, which is the one that ended a Senate career. They took her to surgery at 11:14. They evacuated the hematoma, left the bone flap out, and put her into a medically induced coma to control intracranial pressure. And Dr. Amrita Sondhi, who is 44 years old and has been doing pediatric neurocritical care for 12 years, came out to a waiting room at 3:20 in the morning and found a divorced father sitting in a plastic chair holding his ex-wife's coat. Miles Braddock had arrived at 10:40. Nobody had called him. He had a location share with his daughter that she had turned on herself when she was 14, and when it stopped moving at a hospital, he got in his truck. Dr. Sondhi told him what she had done and what the next 72 hours would be. And then, because she is a good doctor, and because a nurse had flagged something, she told him one more thing, carefully. She said the injury pattern did not match the history she had been given. She said a fall down 4 carpeted steps does not typically produce a linear occipital fracture with that much force, and it does not produce the second injury, which was a pair of parallel bruises on the girl's upper arms, medial aspect, 4 fingers wide on each side, that were already coming up purple when she was intubated. Grip marks. She said, I have documented it. I have photographed it. I am required to report it, and I already have. Miles Braddock said thank you. Then he asked her one question, and it is the first thing in this story that tells you who he actually was. He did not ask who did it. He did not ask whether Sylvie would live. He asked, what time does the hospital's record system stamp your photographs, and does it stamp them to the server or to the device? Dr. Sondhi has said that at the time, she thought it was shock, that people ask strange questions at 3:20 in the morning. It was not shock. It was a man who had spent 27 years knowing that the only thing on earth that survives money is a timestamp on a system nobody thought to control. The machine started moving the next morning, and I want to lay it out in order, because the speed of it is the thing. At 9:15 a.m. on the 23rd, a Wexford County deputy named Curtis Rademan took Brooks Kinsolving's statement at Fair Harrow. It runs 1.5 pages. It records that the residence has a step-down living room, that the child was wearing socks, and that the family is cooperative. It does not record that a laptop was mentioned in the 911 call and was not present in the house. At 11:02 a.m., Dr. Sondi's mandated report reached the Wexford County Department of Social Services and was assigned to an intake worker who had 31 open cases. At 1:40 p.m., a lawyer named Grantley Vale arrived at Chesapeake Children's on behalf of the family, spoke to hospital counsel, and by 4 p.m., there was a note in the chart that the family requested all clinical photographs be reviewed for medical necessity before release to any third party. At 5:30 p.m., Lorna Kinsolving gave a statement to social services in which she said she had been upstairs, had heard nothing unusual, and that her daughter had been unsteady lately. Unsteady lately. That is the sentence she chose. I do not know what to do with that sentence, and neither did Lorna, later, on a witness stand, when a prosecutor read it back to her twice. At 7:15 p.m. on the 24th, a woman named Deirdre Amory, who had been Senator Prentice Kinsolving's chief of staff for 11 years, called Miles Braddock and offered him, in a conversation she believed was not being recorded, $400,000, a mutual non-disclosure agreement, and I am quoting the transcript, help with the medical side of this that goes well beyond what your insurance is going to do. Miles said he would think about it, and then on the 26th of April, at 4:11 in the afternoon, Senator Prentice Kinsolving called Miles Braddock himself from his personal cell phone, which is a thing that a man with 19 years in the United States Senate should have known better than to do, and talked for 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I am not going to read you the whole transcript. 2 sentences will do. He said, I have read your file, or as much of it as anybody is allowed to read, and I want you to understand that whatever you think you are a retired GS-13 with a duplex. And near the end, when Miles had still not said a single word, he said this, You will sign the agreement and you will disappear, or we will finish you off for good, soldier. Soldier. He was never a soldier. 27 years and nobody had ever handed him a rifle. Miles Braddock hung up. And then he did the thing that nobody in the Kinsolving family was equipped to imagine, because it did not look like anything at all. He went back to work. There is a bee farm outside Federalsburg that belongs to a 63-year-old man named Perrin Lockhart, who supervised Miles Braddock for 9 of his 27 years, and who has, since 2019, kept 41 hives and answered his phone twice a week. Miles drove out there on the 27th of April and sat in a plastic chair in a bee yard for 2 hours and told him everything, which took 11 minutes, and then asked him a question, which took the rest. The question was, what is the legal way to do this? Lockhart has testified about this conversation, under a limited waiver, and he said the thing everybody expects a man in that position to say. He said, there isn't one that's fast. He said, you can wait for a county deputy and an overloaded intake worker and a hospital that just got lawyered, and in 14 months you will have nothing, because a man with a senator for a father does not get charged in Wexford County, Maryland. And then Lockhart said the sentence that organized the next 11 weeks of Miles Braddock's life, and it is not a dramatic sentence, which is why I like it. He said, Miles, you were never the guy who broke in. You were the guy they hired. Understand what that means, because it is the mechanism of everything that follows. Miles Braddock had spent 27 years learning that the fastest way into a hard building is not the roof, the wall, the window, or the wire. It is a work order. Nobody in the history of the world has ever tackled a man carrying a ladder. And Fair Harrow, the Kinsolving compound on the water at Cadmus Point, was in the middle of a construction project. Brooks Kinsolving had been building out the north wing since February, a gym, a wine room, and what the permits described as a private treatment suite, which was a 2-bed clinical room with medical gas lines and a nurse call system, because Brooks Kinsolving had decided that the flagship of Cardinal Path Recovery was going to be his own house. A project like that has a general contractor, and a general contractor has a low-voltage sub, and low-voltage subs on the eastern shore of Maryland are a small and unglamorous world in which everybody knows everybody. Miles did not approach the general contractor. That is important, and it is the difference between a professional and everyone else. He approached a woman named Odalise Reyes. Oda Reyes is 49 and had been Miles Braddock's partner on 11 jobs across 3 countries, and is now the owner of a legitimate, licensed, and quite successful firm in Wilmington that does physical security audits and access control commissioning for hospitals and data centers. She employs 14 people. She has a website. She won the Fair Harrow low-voltage contract on the 8th of May with a bid that was legitimate, competitive, and 11% under the incumbent, which she could afford because she wanted it. And on the 11th of May, a 52-year-old technician in a gray work shirt with the name Roy embroidered on the chest showed up at the service gate of Fair Harrow in a van with Reyes integrated on the door, with a badge, a work order, and a valid Maryland low-voltage license in his own legal name, because he had one, because he had spent 3 years pulling cable for dentists. Nobody at Fair Harrow ever looked at the license. He was there for 11 weeks. I want to be very careful about the next part, because it is the part where a lot of stories go stupid. He did not plant illegal wiretaps. He did not intercept private communications. Every single thing he did during those 11 weeks, he did as a subcontracted technician commissioning a security system for the owner of the property, and every one of those things was in the scope of work Brooks Kinsolving signed. The scope of work said, replace and commission the perimeter camera system, the access control, the intercom, the nurse call in the new suite, and the building automation. Which means, in practice, that Brooks Kinsolving hired a man to build, configure, own the passwords to, and hold the administrator credentials for every single sensor in his own house. He gave him the building, and it never occurred to him, because the man was wearing a work shirt. What Miles Braddock did in 11 weeks, he commissioned 41 cameras, and he documented every one, which meant that he had 11 weeks of lawful, owner-consented recordings of a motor court, a boathouse, a service gate, and a north wing under construction. He commissioned the access control on 19 doors, which meant he had 11 weeks of badge logs. Badge logs are the single most underrated document in the world. They do not care who your father is. They record that a fob assigned to R. Rusk entered the boathouse at 8:31 p.m. on the 22nd of April, 27 minutes after a 911 call, and left at 8:44, and that a boat left the lift at 8:51. He commissioned the building automation, including the north wing, including the medical gas panel, and including, because it was in the scope, the compound's backup generator transfer switch and the 2 fiber uplinks that carried everything at Fair Harrow off the property. And he learned the shape of the security detail, because a man commissioning cameras has to walk every post with the people who stand at them. The detail was contracted to a firm called Ardennes Group. On a normal day, there were 9 men on the property. Between the 11th of July and the 20th, because of what the family knew was coming, there were 31. 31 is the number in this story that everybody repeats, and everybody repeats it wrong. They say it like it was 31 men against 1 man. Miles Braddock looked at 31 and saw something else entirely. He saw a group of professionals, most of them former military, most of them decent, all of them on 12-hour shifts on a peninsula, who did not know each other's names, who had been briefed by a family that was lying to them, and who were connected to their command by exactly 2 fiber lines and 1 cellular repeater that a technician in a gray work shirt had installed himself. 31 men is not a fortress. 31 men is a network, and a network is a thing you can operate. He also did something in those 11 weeks that had nothing to do with any of that, and it is the part I think about most. He found Danny Pruitt's file. Cardinal Path Recovery's records lived on a server in a closet in the basement of Fair Harrow, because Brooks Kinsolving did not trust cloud storage, which is very funny. That closet was in the scope of work, because the network core was in it. Miles did not touch the server. He photographed the rack. He photographed the labels. He wrote down the make, the model, the serial numbers, and the 2 IP ranges. He recorded, on his own commissioning log, that the Cardinal Path file server was physically located at a private residence and was not on a HIPAA-compliant network segment, which is a sentence that, all by itself, is a federal problem for 11 treatment facilities. And then he sent that commissioning log on the 19th of June in the ordinary course of business as a licensed contractor's deficiency report to the general contractor, the property owner, the insurance carrier for the project, and the Maryland Department of Health's facility licensing unit. He mailed a piece of paper. The Department of Health opened an inquiry on the 7th of July. Cardinal Path Recovery's Delaware billing intermediary got a records request on the 14th, and an assistant United States attorney in Baltimore named Tobias Nkemelu, who had been sitting on Charlene Pruitt's insurance complaint since May with no way in, suddenly had a licensed engineer's dated report saying that the patient records of a treatment network were sitting in a senator's son's basement. By the 20th of July, there was a federal grand jury. There is a detail from those 11 weeks that did not come out until the sentencing hearing, when Oda Reyes read a letter into the record. Every one of those 77 days, Miles Braddock worked a full shift at Fair Harrow. 7 in the morning until 4:30, in a gray work shirt, pulling cable in a house belonging to the man who had put his daughter in a coma, being handed a bottle of water by the site superintendent, saying good morning to contractors he would zip tie in July, eating a sandwich in a van in a motor court. And then every one of those 77 nights, he drove 1 hour and 40 minutes to Baltimore and sat in a room on the 4th floor of Chesapeake Children's from 6:30 until visiting hours ended, and read out loud to a girl who was not awake. Not books. The nurses noticed, and they wrote it in their notes, which is how we know. He read her the manuals, the install manual for the camera system he was commissioning, the spec sheet for a nurse call panel, the Maryland low-voltage code, section by section, in that flat, unhurried, technical voice, because when she was small, that voice put her to sleep on a bath towel, on a floor, with 40 pieces of a tape recorder laid out in order. A night nurse named Ivo Baptiste testified that he heard the man read the same paragraph about conduit fill ratios 11 nights in a row, and that on the 11th night he stopped in the middle of it and did not start again for about a minute, and then finished the paragraph. That is what those 11 weeks actually were. Not a plan. A man going to work in the morning in his enemy's house, and going to work at night in his daughter's room, and not once in 77 days letting anybody at either address see one thing on his face, none of which was going to save his daughter. That is the thing. Sylvie Braddock came out of the induced coma on the 11th of May, and she did not wake up. She was, in the language of the chart, minimally conscious. She tracked a face sometimes. On the 2nd of June, she squeezed Dr. Sondi's hand once on request, and then not again for 9 days. And the criminal case for what happened to her was, as of the 20th of July, nothing. The Wexford County investigation had been administratively closed on the 9th of June for insufficient evidence. Lorna Kinsolving's statement said she heard nothing. The clinical photographs were tied up in a records fight. Brooks Kinsolving had not been interviewed under oath a single time. And on the 18th of July, Grantley Vale filed a petition in Wexford County Circuit Court on behalf of Lorna and Brooks Kinsolving to have Sylvie Braddock transferred out of Chesapeake Children's into a private long-term care arrangement. The private treatment suite in the north wing of Fair Harrow had a certificate of occupancy dated the 9th of July. They were going to put her in the house. They were going to move a minimally conscious 16-year-old girl into a 2-bed clinical room in the home of the man who put her there, staffed by nurses employed by his company, and every doctor who ever saw her again would work for Cardinal Path Recovery. The hearing was set for the 29th of July. Miles Braddock finished commissioning the Fair Harrow security system on the 24th of July, walked the general contractor through the punch list, got his final payment approved, shook the site superintendent's hand, and drove off the property at 4:20 in the afternoon. He came back at 1:11 the following morning. Before I tell you what he did that night, I have to tell you what he decided not to do, because it is the single most important decision in this entire story, and almost nobody notices it. He decided not to hurt anybody, not out of squeamishness. Miles Braddock had been in 9 countries, and there are 2 years of his life that Perrin Lockhart will not discuss under any waiver. He decided it for a reason he explained to exactly one person, and the person was Oda Reyes, in her kitchen in Wilmington, on the 22nd of July, and she wrote it on the back of an envelope afterward because she wanted to remember the wording. He said, "If one of those men gets hurt, the story becomes the night a father lost his mind. If none of them do, the story stays what it is." He said, "My daughter is going to have to live in whatever version of this survives." Everything that happened on the 25th of July flows out of those 2 sentences. It is why the plan is what it is. It is why there are no gunshots in this story. And it is why, 11 months later, A jury believed every word out of his mouth. Here is what he built. 5 parts, and each part is a thing he already owned because a rich man paid him to build it. Part 1 was the causeway. Fair Harrow sits on a hook of land at Cadmus Point with one road onto it, a 900-foot causeway with water on both sides, and Miles did not block it, because blocking a road is a felony that looks like a felony. He did something better. At 12:40 a.m., he called in a report of a downed tree with wires across Threadneedle Road, from a phone in his own name, truthfully, because at 12:31 a.m., a 40-year-old loblolly pine on the county right-of-way had come down across the road, having been cut 90% through at the base at some point earlier that day by a person unknown, and having been pushed over by a wind gust of 11 knots. I am telling you what the county's report says. The county's report says wind. An Eastern Shore utility crew and 2 sheriff's units spent the next 3 hours on Threadneedle Road, 4.5 miles from the compound, and everybody who wanted to drive to or from Fair Harrow that night had a very long conversation with a very tired lineman. Part 2 was the light. At 1:11 a.m., the 2 fiber uplinks that carried every camera, every alarm, every phone extension, and the Ardennes Group's command link off the Fair Harrow property stopped carrying anything. They stopped because both of them terminated in a demarcation cabinet on the exterior of the service building that Miles Braddock had personally installed in May, and because he had a key to it, issued to him, logged, and still valid, because nobody had revoked a contractor's credential in the 11 weeks since. He did not cut them. He unseated them and left them lying in the cabinet, undamaged, which the FBI's evidence photographs show and which his lawyer put in front of a jury 11 times. Part 3 was the generator. When the fiber went, the alarm panel called for the generator, which it always did, and the generator started, which it always did, and it ran for 4 minutes and then shut down on a low coolant fault, because the coolant sensor was reading 0, because on the 24th of July a technician had documented that sensor as defective on the punch list, in writing, and had left the replacement part on the shelf in the mechanical room with the work order taped to it. He wrote the failure down before it happened. That is not sabotage. That is a deficiency report. His lawyer used that sentence in closing. Part 4 was the men. And this is the part I find genuinely brilliant. 31. Ardennes Group contractors were on that property. Their radios worked, because radios are local. What did not work, at 1:11 in the morning, was the repeater on the boathouse roof that linked their radios to their off-site command, the site phone lines, the cameras their site lead used to see the property, the access control on 19 doors, and the cellular signal. Because Fair Harrow sits in a hole, and its cell service was a licensed small cell that Miles had installed and that ran on the same fiber. 31 professional men on 12-hour shifts, on a peninsula, in the dark, with no cameras, no doors, no command, and one road that had a downed power line on it. And then, at 1:19 a.m., every single one of them heard the same thing. Miles Braddock walked out into the middle of the motor court, in a gray work shirt, with a flashlight pointed at his own face, and he used the compound's public address system, the one in the scope of work, the one he had commissioned on the 4th of June, the one that runs on its own local amplifier and does not need the internet, and he said, on a loop, on speakers mounted on 4 buildings, the following. My name is Miles Braddock. I am the low-voltage contractor for this property. I am not armed. I am not here for any of you. There is a federal grand jury in Baltimore with an open matter on this address. Everything that happens on this property tonight is being recorded to a device you cannot reach and copied off-site. You are being paid $1,100 a shift to protect a man who put a 16-year-old girl in a coma on the 22nd of April in that kitchen. You can verify that with your own eyes. There is a photograph taped to the inside of the service gate. I am going to be in the north wing. Nobody has to touch me. Then he walked, unhurried, across his own commissioning drawings, to the north wing. 27 of the 31 Ardennes Group contractors did nothing at all that night. They held their posts, which is what they were paid to do, and they held their posts harder than usual, because a man on a loudspeaker had just told them there was a federal grand jury. 4 of them went to find him. The site lead was a 41-year-old named Dane Kessel, 11 years in the Rangers, 2 tours, and a man who had taken this contract because it paid double and his wife was pregnant. Kessel got to the North Wing corridor at 1:26 a.m., and by then 2 of his 4 were already sitting on the floor of that corridor with their wrists secured in front of them with their own restraints, uninjured, one of them mildly embarrassed, in a hallway where the emergency lighting had been unplugged in a pattern that a man who wired it would know. Kessel has testified about what happened next. He said the corridor was dark and he could hear his own 2 men breathing, and he understood, in about 4 seconds, that he was inside a building that belonged to somebody else, not legally, operationally. He said, out loud, into the dark, "Are we doing this?" And Miles Braddock's voice came from somewhere behind him and to the left, at conversational volume, and said, "No. Your guy on the west post has a torn ACL brace and I moved his chair. There's a photograph on the gate. Go look at it and then decide." Kessel went and looked at it. The photograph taped to the inside of the service gate at Fair Harrow, in a plastic sleeve, was a clinical photograph from Chesapeake Children's, dated the 23rd of April, of the upper arms of a 16-year-old girl, with parallel purple bruises, 4 fingers wide, on the medial aspect of each arm, with the hospital's system timestamp printed across the bottom corner, because a man had asked a doctor, at 3:20 in the morning, what stamps the photographs. Dr. Sandy had provided it lawfully, to the parent, on a records request, in June. Dane Kessel stood at a gate at 1:34 in the morning and looked at that for a while. Then he keyed his radio and told all 31 of his people to hold their posts, touch nothing, and log everything, and he called his own company's duty officer on a landline in the gatehouse, which worked, because Miles had left the gatehouse landline alive on purpose. At 1:41 a.m., Dane Kessel called the Maryland State Police himself. That was the plan. That was always the plan. That was the entire point of the loudspeaker. Brooks Kinsolving woke up at 1:22 a.m. to a dark house and no phone signal, and he did what a man like that does, which is go looking for staff. He went out through the North Wing corridor in a t-shirt and pajama pants at 1:29, and he did not make it to the gym. He woke up at 3:50 in the morning strapped to a gurney in his own private treatment suite. I need to be exact about this, because his lawyers were not. He was on a hospital gurney, in restraints, padded, 4-point, medical, the ones his own company had bought for that room. He had a bruised jaw and a mild concussion. He had a blood pressure cuff on, and an SpO2 clip, because the man who put him there had turned on the monitor, because the man who put him there is the man who wired the monitor. The nurse call panel was on, the room's camera was running, and there were 3 other people in that room. Dane Kessel of the Ardennes Group, standing by the door with his arms crossed. Corporal Yancey Delahoussaye of the Maryland State Police, who had arrived at 3:31 after walking the last 400 yards past a downed power line. And Miles Braddock, sitting in a chair beside the gurney, with a laptop on his knees, in a gray work shirt. 2 law enforcement or contracted security witnesses, a running camera, a conscious man on a monitor. Nothing about that room was a torture chamber, and everything about it was a deposition. That is what 27 years does to a person. He did not build a revenge, he built a record. Brooks Kinsolving opened his eyes and said, "What is this?" Miles Braddock said, "Lesson 1. And then he said the sentence that has been played on cable news enough times that people quote it wrong. He said, "You don't touch my daughter." Then he turned the laptop around. On the screen was a file manager, and in the file manager was a folder, and in the folder were 411 items, and Brooks Kinsolving read the names of them for about 9 seconds before he stopped talking for the rest of his life. Badge logs, 41, camera archives, 11 weeks of them, the commissioning report with the server rack in his basement, the generator punch list, the insurance carrier's acknowledgement, the Maryland Department of Health inquiry number, and, in a subfolder named Pruitt, a 41-second audio file. Because Sylvie Braddock's laptop was at the bottom of the Chesapeake, but Sylvie Braddock backed her folders up to a network drive in her father's duplex every Wednesday night at 6:15 while she ate something greasy. Because when she was 11, he had told her that a file that exists in one place does not exist. 0409, ice rink drain, half-tide. Wave had been sitting on a $200 drive in a rented duplex 14 minutes away since the 9th of April. He had had it the whole time. He had not gone to Fair Harrow that night to get anything. He had gone there to make 31 professional witnesses, 1 state trooper, and a running camera watch him hand it over. At 4:11 a.m., Miles Braddock stood up, closed the laptop, put his hands behind his back without being asked, and told Corporal Delahose that he was going to be arrested for a number of things, and that he would like to give a full statement without a lawyer present. He gave it for 9 hours. Miles Braddock was charged, and I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story going around does not mention it. He was charged with 4th-degree burglary, false imprisonment, 2nd-degree assault, malicious destruction of property under $1,000, and interfering with a communication system. He spent 9 days in the Wexford County Detention Center. His bail was set at $200,000, and Oda Reyes and Perrin Lockhart and 11 low-voltage contractors from 3 counties posted it. His lawyer was a 56-year-old former public defender named Marguerite Sowerby, who took the case for $1 and told him on day 1 that they were not going to argue that he did nothing. They were going to argue about what he did instead. Here is what a jury in Wexford County, Maryland heard 11 months later. They heard that 31 armed contractors were on that property and that not one of them was injured. And they heard it from 22 of those contractors, because the defense called them, and every one of them said the same thing, and 4 of them said it while crying. They heard Dane Kessel say that in 11 years in the Rangers, and 9 as a contractor, he had never seen a building taken away from a security detail without a shot, and that he called the state police himself, and that he had a daughter. They heard the 41-second recording. Twice. The judge allowed it twice. They heard Dr. Amrita Sondhi explain, for 50 minutes, the difference between a fall and a grip. They heard Charlene Pruitt say the words $11,400 2 days after my son was dead. And they heard Miles Braddock, on the stand for 2 days, explain in flat, unhurried, technical English exactly how he had done all of it, and exactly why every single component of it was a thing the owner of the property had paid him to build. The jury acquitted him on burglary, false imprisonment, and assault, and convicted him on malicious destruction of property and interfering with a communication system, which are misdemeanors. The judge, a woman named Estelle Farquharson, sentenced him to time served plus 1 year of supervised probation, and then said, on the record, that she was noting for the appellate record that she considered the 2 convictions the minimum the law would tolerate and the maximum justice would bear. Now, the other side of the ledger. Brooks Kinsolving was indicted in September on 11 federal counts and in October by the state of Maryland. The federal case was healthcare fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and violation of the anti-kickback statute, built on Cardinal Path Recovery's own server, which the FBI seized out of a basement closet in a senator's son's house on the 3rd of August, using a warrant whose supporting affidavit cited, at paragraph 9, a licensed contractor's deficiency report dated the 19th of June. The state case was first-degree child abuse resulting in severe bodily injury and obstruction. He was convicted on all of it. He is serving 31 years and will be eligible for parole when he is 62. Renzo Rusk, the man who said 11 words in a parking lot, took a plea in January and testified for 9 days and got 14 years. 6 other Cardinal Path employees pleaded. 2 were acquitted. The operations director who drove the van hanged herself in a hotel in Delaware in February, and I am not going to make a point out of that. Senator Prentice Kinsolving was never charged with anything relating to his granddaughter, which is what he called Sylvie in a press conference, which was the first time in 19 months anybody had heard him use the word. He was charged with witness tampering, because of a 6-minute and 40-second phone call on the 26th of April from his personal cell phone in which he told a man to sign an agreement and disappear or be finished off for good, and because Deirdre Amory's call 2 days earlier had offered $400,000, and because there is no version of those 2 calls that is not an attempt to buy silence about a felony. He resigned his seat on the 11th of November before the Ethics Committee finished. He pleaded to 1 count in March. 18 months. His boat was sold at auction. Lorna Kinsolving was not charged. I want to be careful about her, because she is the hardest person in this story. She testified for the state, against her husband, for 2 days, and it was the most painful testimony in the trial, according to 3 reporters who were there. She admitted she had said unsteady lately. She admitted she had been told what to say and had said it. She admitted she had signed the petition to move her daughter into that house. She said, and this is verbatim, "I did not think he had done it, and then, later, I did not let myself think he had done it." And a prosecutor let that sit in the room for about 10 seconds. She and Miles are not friends. They are 2 people who sit in the same room 3 afternoons a week, because Sylvie Braddock woke up. Not the way it happens in a movie. She had already been surfacing in fragments for months. On the 14th of September she said a word, and the word was cold. In November she was consistently following commands. In February she said her father's name, which she pronounced wrong for 11 days because of the aphasia, and which he answered to anyway, every single time, exactly as pronounced. She has a left side weakness she works on 4 days a week. She loses words when she is tired, which she describes as the word being in a room with the door shut, which is a hell of a thing for a girl who records sound for a living to say about her own head. She cannot do the stairs at her mother's house without a rail. She is 19 now. In April, 3 years after a parking lot, Sylvie Braddock enrolled at a community college in Wilmington in an audio production certificate program. She goes 2 days a week. Her father drives her because she is not cleared to drive yet, and they leave at 6:15, and there is usually something greasy in a paper bag. She has, on a $200 network drive in a rented duplex, 1,141 audio files, and one of them is 41 seconds long, and she has never once listened to it again, and she knows exactly which folder it is in. Charlene Pruitt was in the gallery for every day of both trials, 7.5 months total, and she and Miles Braddock sat in the same row for most of it, and did not talk much, because neither of them is a talker. She runs a thing now, out of a church basement in Hagerstown, that helps families in 11 states get the actual billing records for a kid in a treatment program, which sounds like the most boring form of activism ever invented, and has, at last count, shut down 4 facilities. I want to end this one by arguing with the internet a little, because the version of this story that gets shared is the wrong one. The version that gets shared is the night, 31 contractors, the loudspeaker, the gurney, lesson 1, and I understand why. It is a hell of a night, but I have gone through all of it. The trial transcripts, the county report about a tree, the badge logs, and I have come around to thinking that the 25th of July was the least important night in this story. Because here is what actually happened on the 25th of July. A man who already had the evidence, who had already mailed it to a health department in June, who had already caused a federal grand jury to convene on the 20th, drove onto a property in the dark and made a very large number of people watch him hand it over. He did not go there to win. He went there because he understood something that everybody with money forgets. Evidence does not defeat power. Evidence plus witnesses defeats power. He needed 31 professionals, a state trooper, and a running camera, because he knew exactly what would have happened to a manila envelope from a retired GS-13 with a duplex. The things that actually saved his daughter were not tactical at all, and I want to name all 4 of them, because they are available to you. A doctor who wrote down that the injury did not match the story, and photographed it, and reported it, on a night when it would have been much easier to accept a sentence about carpeted stairs. A mother in Hagerstown who called an insurance company 47 times and asked a question about a bill. A contractor who mailed a piece of paper to a licensing board in the ordinary course of business. And a 16-year-old with a $50 recorder who did not stop recording when the van pulled in, because her father had told her when she was 11 that amateurs stop. Not one of those 4 things is brave in the way we usually mean it. Every one of them is somebody doing a small, boring, correct thing on a day when nobody was watching, and then keeping a copy. So here is the only thing I will ask of you, and it is not go count anything or go test anything. It is smaller than that. If somebody you love tells you something that does not fit, a bruise with a story attached, a bill with a wrong date, a sentence that sounds rehearsed, write down the date and what they actually said, in their words, and keep it somewhere that is not the same place as the thing itself. You will almost certainly never need it. But a file that exists in one place does not exist. A man taught that to an 11-year-old on the floor of a duplex with a tape recorder in 40 pieces on a bath towel. And 7 years later, it was the only reason anybody ever found out what happened to a 19-year-old boy in a parking lot, or to her.